And Ken Resnicow is the Irving Rosenstock Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and Professor of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine. The Associate Director for Community Engagement and Health Disparities Research at the University of Michigan Rogel Cancer Center and Chief Scientific Lead at the university's Center for Health Communications Research. So Ken's work is something both me and Nelly bumped into in our PhD studies. And it has spanned over the last 30 years and has focused on designing and evaluating behavior change programs for a wide variety of health behaviors, including smoking cessation, breast cancer treatment, genetic testing, cancer screening, car safety, weight control, diet and physical activity, effective parenting, medical adherence, organ donation, substance use, youth violence, and risk behaviors, and accrual into clinical trials. He's published more than 340 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and has served on numerous panels and review groups. In recent years, his work has increasingly entailed novel behavioral tailoring and incorporation of e-health technology in order to enhance the impact of health messages. And he has collaborated all over the world and also trained more than 1,000 health professionals in motivational interviewing in both academic and health delivery settings. And he's going to tell us about the complexities and nonlinearity about the behavior change process and what are some promising directions where we should take our research designs. So Ken, I'm very glad to have you here and welcome. Take it away.
Thank you for the fine introduction, Maddie. Thank you, Nelly, for inviting me. This is one of the most enjoyable talks I can give because it forces me to really think. I don't have a canned slideshow. I really went back and made this all new for this presentation, and I'm really excited to share it with everybody. I think it makes a lot of sense for me to follow what Daniel just did. I think Daniel just laid a really nice theoretical background. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit. I'm going to give you some very specific examples of complexity and nonlinearity in motivation and behavior change. And I look forward to your questions at the end. I wish I could be in Finland with you. It's one of my favorite places, but instead I'm stuck here in Michigan. And I am in the city of Ann Arbor, which is not too far. Right here is the Canadian border. So that's right where Toronto is, right here, Canada. I'm at the University of Michigan, and we're proud for a few things. We're known for our sports teams. And in the United States, we have this very weird thing called college sports, where we have, in effect, professional student athletes. But our university is also known for its research. We're actually the #1 public research university in the United States. So I have a very ambitious agenda today. I'd like to address all of this. I'm going to start by discussing sudden change, which I think I'm so happy I woke up a little earlier to listen to Daniel. I think is a variation on critical transitions. And I want to talk a little bit about this sort of nonlinearity of motivation and behavior. Then I want to get into this problem that is sort of a dirty secret we have, that it's very hard to replicate medical and behavioral research. I want to give a complexity interpretation of that. And then following that, I want to talk about this idea of treatment response being heterogeneous. And I think moderation of treatment effects, I think, can be viewed from a complexity perspective. During the discussion, I'm going to introduce 3 other concepts: sensitivity to initial conditions, optimal variability, and therapeutic inertia, and show you how these help explain and understand the top 3 topics. And then I'm going to, I think I'll have time, show you some new designs, particularly reinforcement learning, that can embrace complexity much better than the traditional randomized trial. So let's see if we can accomplish all of this. So let's start with sudden change. So first of all, I believe it's fair to say that the major models of behavior change, the health belief model, theory of planned behavior, social cognitive theory, and transcendental model, in general, assume a linear approach, that they look at change as gradual, rational, predictable, and planned. That if I can increase your perceived severity and susceptibility, if I can change your decisional balance by having more pros than cons, we will achieve change. What I want to challenge is this whole idea of gradual, rational, and planned. So there's this concept in the literature of nonlinear change, and it goes by many names. Sometimes it's called this, and etc. I won't read them all. But I want to give you some specific examples of how it's been demonstrated. How do you prove that change is sometimes nonlinear, unplanned, sudden, and spontaneous? So I'm going to give you examples from smoking cessation, alcohol recovery, and mental health treatment. And then we'll try and unify the results. So let's start with a really wonderful study that triggered for me a whole line of research. So in this study, they looked at 900 current smokers and 800 ex-smokers, and they had to have quit between 1 month and 10 years ago. And they asked them, in your most recent quit attempt, which of these best characterizes how you did it? Okay, take a look. And what they did is divide these pathways to change into unplanned and planned. So they created a binary variable of unplanned and planned based upon these different survey items that describe your last quit attempt. And then what they did is looked at the outcomes of your smoking cessation quit attempt based upon whether or not it was unplanned or planned, spontaneous or gradual. Now they look at it in 3 ways. It really doesn't matter which way, and I'll go through them very quickly, but the conclusion is the same. So in this particular analysis, they looked at both current smokers, which means relapsers because they quit and started, and then successful continued ex-smokers. And these people had to have quit 6 months to 5 years before. The definition of success here is not permanent abstinence, because of course we have current smokers in here, but the definition of success is your quit attempt lasted at least 6 months. So it's a binary variable. Did your quit attempt last for 6 months? What you see is the unplanned quitters, 65% of them had a successful quit attempt using this definition, only 42% of planned quitters. If you limit the sample to people who only quit more recently in the past 6 to 12 months, the finding is pretty much identical. 50% achieved sustained abstinence up to 6 months, at least 6 months, and 29% of the planned quitters. So you see again a benefit of unplanned versus planned, unplanned versus planned. And finally, this just has the current smokers, which are in effect the relapsers, and 36% of the people who quit in an unplanned manner achieved at least 6 months abstinence versus 21%. So I think you can see from this study that folks who reported that they quit in an unplanned way had in effect better outcomes. And if you look at the multivariate adjusted odds ratios of having a successful 6-month quit attempt, adjusting for things like medication use, age, gender, and age, the effects of unplanned are statistically better than the effects of planned. So it's comparing this group to this group. Now I'd like to talk about a study that I think was very important. I'm very pleased I found it in preparation for this workshop. What Hughes and his team did is they took 40 tobacco users who had some intention to quit over the next 3 months. So if you are a stage of change person, sort of at least contemplators perhaps. But what made this study so fascinating is he asked them to call in every night to report their quit intentions for the next day, and they did so for 28 days. They called in the night before to say, what do you plan to do tomorrow? And what they found is, prospectively, which is what is the power of the study, 44% of the quit attempts that occurred were unplanned, which means they occurred on days with no intentions to quit the night before. This is very important because one of the criticisms of the sudden change literature has been it's a retrospective biased recall, that it is storytelling, that if you change a difficult behavior like your weight, like your drug use, it sounds very good to say, I just woke up one day and decided. And that criticism has been lingering for years. This study shows that it really does look like prospectively sudden change or unplanned quitting is not simply an artifact of your recall bias or of a desire to tell a compelling Hollywood story. So this study shows two important things. One, that it was common, 44% of the quit attempts were unplanned, and more importantly, it confirms the retrospective studies that about 40%, it looks like, of quit attempts are spontaneous. Now, to make the unplanned quitting even more complex, I want to share with you a result from a study we did on unplanned quitting a few years back. So we sampled several thousand US smokers, but we specifically made sure we had adequate numbers across ethnicities. So we had adequate numbers of African Americans, Hispanics, and whites. And what we found is something that just shows the classic interaction effect, that the effect of planned versus unplanned quitting interacts with both how heavy of a smoker you were and your race. So I'm just going to show you the race interaction here. What we found is we use days abstinent. What we found is for whites, those who had a planned quit attempt averaged 58 days abstinent from that quit attempt. Whereas, similar to the Ferguson study, 103 days of abstinence in the unplanned. So it almost doubles the success rate if you think of it as successful to be abstinent for more days. For Hispanics, 125 days in the unplanned group versus 79 days in the planned group. But for African Americans, we see an interaction effect. For African Americans, the effect was in the opposite direction. 91 days of sustained abstinence in the planned group versus 57 in the unplanned group. Now, this is going to come into play in great detail as we progress in the talk to show how this moderated world, which I think is a manifestation of complexity, requires matching and mismatching designs in order to test whether or not this difference is real. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now let's show you another example of sudden change. In this case, they call it sudden gains in the mental health and the alcohol world. They looked at 102 women. They got a 20-session CBT intervention over 6 months. There were 3 potential sudden gains that they measured: urge intensity, urge frequency, and % drinking days. And although it is somewhat complicated, they used a relatively straightforward definition of a sudden gain. Basically, your score on these variables had to jump. It had to increase at least 25% of its previous value between any 2 sessions, and that was defined as a sudden gain. What they found is a third of the sample experienced at least one sudden gain across these 3 different outcomes. That's the % drinking day, urge intensity, and urge frequency. And most importantly, they found that when you had a sudden gain for urge frequency versus not having a sudden gain, it was associated with less drinking at follow-up. So those who had a more dramatic, catastrophic, critical transition in their feeling about their ability to control their urges, those people had better outcomes. That's similar to what we found in the smoking studies. Then I'll show you the same phenomena in cognitive therapy for depression. In this study, they took 60 moderately to severe depressed adults who had an elevated score on the Hamilton Depression Scale. They got 16 weeks of standardized cognitive therapy. Normally, that produces about a 12 to 15 point improvement on the Beck Depression Inventory. They define sudden gains in a complex way. It's very fitting for this talk. And I won't go into it, but trust me, these are legitimate definitions of sudden gain. This one we've already seen, a 25% increase, but they also talked about some absolute changes and different scores, but they really make quite logical sense that there is various ways to detect whether or not their depressive symptoms resolved gradually or in this more transitional, catastrophic, chaotic way. So 24 of the 60 patients had a sudden gain during treatment, and it averaged 11 points on the Beck, which is a lot. So that's almost the full range of intervention effects occurred between 2 sessions. That's what's important here. This is not their overall changes, it's between any 2 sessions. What's interesting is it occurred around session 5. Now let's take these 35 responders. So 19 responders out of 24 in the sudden gains group, and 16 out of 36 or 44% in the no sudden gains group. Let's track what happened to those 35 responders over the next 2 years. And what they found, I think, is quite compelling. When you look at these 35 individuals, remember they all start at 1.0 because they all were responders to treatment. So this is the post-treatment response. They are all technically not clinically depressed. For those who changed gradually, only 34% were still recovered at 24-month follow-up. Whereas those people who had that large between sessions sudden gain, that surge, that jump, that trampoline, 73% of that group was still doing well 24 months later. The same pattern has been observed for OCD. It's been observed for anxiety disorder, and has also been observed for other studies of depression. So what do we make of the sudden change literature? So first of all, I think it's important to note that it's difficult to predict. Virtually none of these studies had any baseline measure or any ongoing measure that was able to predict when a sudden gain would occur. So I consider that, just like Daniel's presentation, I think sort of mentioned this, a very high research priority. How do we try to predict one of these phase changes? Conceptually, what I'd like to point out is I think this type of motivation is very different than how we construct it in our traditional models. I believe it is fair to say that this motivation arrives, it surges from within. You don't construct it. It actually occurs usually without any new information. It's the reorganization internally of maybe existing fragments of knowledge and attitude, but it is not necessarily the product of any new inputs. I think that's a very fascinating phenomenon. And again, it has many names in the literature, tipping points. Some people talk about trampolines, waves, spurts, and surges. It may have a quantum element. Motivation may be more wave than particle. What that means is if we're going to try to predict it, I think we're going to have to measure it prospectively, measure it frequently, like with EMA, ecologic momentary assessment, which is a fancy way of saying your phone or your computer prompt you to do multiple assessments, sometimes per day, in some cases per hour. And what I think, sort of building on what Daniel said, we're trying to detect the wobble. Just before things change, there's this sort of vibration in the system. Can we detect that? And finally, I think the most interesting question is, can we create it? Do we have any intervention strategies that can create sudden change? Or is it sort of just this true but useless observation that we can never replicate? Now, I want to argue that I think motivational interviewing is a very reasonable approach to trying to create sudden change by giving the individual the space to let this reorganize, to let those fragments of knowledge and attitude reorganize. I think MI gives you a better chance at having a spontaneous epiphany, which is another word for it, than models that are more controlling, that are more didactic. And then, as we'll talk about, there's various designs we could use to test whether or not gradual versus sudden change may be more effective. And there have been a few randomized trials in the smoking literature where they've actually randomized people to go cold turkey versus tapering, which is one form of sudden change versus gradual change. Now let's move on to our second topic. And it may seem initially a little disjointed from sudden change, but I hope I'll be able to stitch them together. And it's the issue of replication of medical and behavioral research. There is actually a pretty substantial literature that there are major limitations in our ability to replicate what our peers observe. I really want to focus just on these two publications. Particularly this one has a tremendous number of citations. And John Ioannidis, who's at Stanford, is really famous for questioning why don't medical studies get replicated? What is going on? And it turns out our behavioral science colleagues have done the same sort of analyses. I want to share these two and then give you a complexity interpretation. So Ioannidis published this very high impact paper, and basically he said there's something weird going on here. A lot of our most important randomized trials in medicine, when they were replicated, didn't replicate. And I'm summarizing the findings from his paper, and basically of the most important clinical research studies, very high impact studies like the Nurses' Health Study, which you've probably seen many times in your career if you're a health researcher on this conference. 16% of those studies have been completely contradicted, and another 16% were found to have much stronger effects than the replication. So if you add that up, 32% of the most important medical studies were either contradicted or could not be replicated. And this is just a table from that study. This shows you, these are very important studies about the effects of estrogen on health, the effects of vitamin E on health, and various surgical techniques. These studies were not generally replicated. Now, the same was true when you look at behavioral studies. So the Open Science Collaboration took 100 experiments from high impact psychology journals, and in general, the replication effects were only half of the originally reported results. Only 36% of the replication, sorry for the typo there, had a statistically significant result. So why is there failure to replicate, and what is the role of complexity here? So first of all, there's many explanations for the failure to replicate. It could be that journals have a bias for positive results, negative studies get buried, and maybe it's possible that negative studies are more reproducible, so that lack of effects or no studies may actually be more reproducible, but because of journal bias, we don't see them as much. Then there could be author bias. They have motivated reasoning. It benefits us to have positive effects. It might unconsciously lead us to cherry pick our results or do favorable analysis with covariates that make the effects significant. We may select samples that are more likely to respond. And then there's even a more misanthropic interpretation that people are outright being deceptive with their data. I'm not interested so much in 1 and 2. What I'm interested in is number 3. I think even if 1 and 2 have no impact, I think the replication difficulties really could be explained from a complexity perspective. What do I mean? Let's introduce sensitivity to initial conditions here. I'm sure you all heard of the butterfly effect. Let's take a look at this video, which nicely captures it. So of course, this is the butterfly effect. What I want to argue is that the initial conditions of studies, particularly in behavioral science, but even in medical research, are in effect initial conditions that can dramatically change the outcome of these studies. So if we replicate a study, but we change any of these parameters, the age, the race, the gender, the SES status, or even where we do it, we go from a public hospital to a private hospital, we move from the UK to the US, we move from the Netherlands to Germany. Those subtle things I think can be viewed as initial conditions. But why I think it's even more important for behavioral science is these things here, I think, are very dramatic influencers of outcomes. So if you just change the intervention a little bit, you change who the therapist is. In the original study, they used PhDs, we used masters. They had 14 hours of training, we had 7. They measured fidelity with this method, we measured it with this method. I believe changing any of these parameters from an original study, which is often done, it's very rare that we replicate verbatim. It's very rare that we perfectly replicate. I believe this could be a very logical explanation for the lack of replication, particularly in behavioral science. Now, this raises a sister concept, which is the heterogeneity of treatment response. I often talk about another dirty secret that very few of us, I think, like to have to address, and that is when you look at intervention effects, often our interventions only work for subgroups, and therefore they're moderated, okay? There's interaction effects. And what do we do with that? So first of all, I'd like to interpret that from a complexity perspective. As I mentioned earlier, for example, that unplanned quitting didn't seem to work as well for African Americans. I'm just looking at some of our work from the last few years, okay? So we did randomized trials with just 2 or 3 groups. We did not necessarily a priori predict these interaction effects. So in this study, where we randomized blacks and whites to get 2 different smoking interventions, we showed a very interesting interaction effect. I'm going to actually show that to you in a minute. I'm not going to talk about these in detail because I want to move on in a few minutes, but we found when we did tailored messaging based upon self-determination theory, we found that the tailoring really only mattered for individuals with high autonomy needs, so that the self-determination messaging really only mattered if you had a high need for autonomy. And then in this study where we tailored messages for African Americans in the US, the tailored cultural messaging really only worked if you had 2 types of ethnic identity. One was called pro-Black, another one was called racial mistrust. But for the other 3 types of ethnic identity, the tailoring didn't matter. So this is very common that our interventions only work for subgroups. Let me show you the first one in a little bit of detail. So we took 204 smokers and randomly assigned them to motivational interviewing or health education. We consider those conceptually distinct interventions. MI being more autonomy supportive, MI being a method that helps you build intrinsic motivation, overcome your resistance, and health education is more directive. Both groups had the same dose, 4 sessions over 18 weeks, and the main outcome was quit attempts and sustained abstinence. So this is the sort of classic definition of MI, and our therapists were trained very extensively. Their fidelity to MI was very strong. This is what we mean by health education. It's more directive, it's conceptually distinct from MI. We had hypothesized MI would be better than health ed. That was the original hypothesis, but it's not what we found. We found this interaction term, and in this case, race was the interaction variable. So for white folks, okay, in this case, it's not Black because there was also a few folks who were neither white nor Black. Motivational interviewing was more effective at instilling a quit attempt, about 70% versus 62, than health education. So for non-Blacks or mostly white people, MI was superior to health ed, although it was not statistically significant. However, the opposite was observed for African Americans. For African Americans, health education was statistically superior to motivational interviewing. Then we drilled down to try and find out why. Here's where things get complex. Well, we asked them about their communication preference. Do you want to be told what to do, or do you need autonomy? And when we divided people into the directive or non-directive preference, African Americans were far more likely to say, I want a directive counselor, whereas white folks wanted a non-directive counselor. And then when we entered that moderator into the regression model, it erased that racial treatment interaction. So what we were able to show is that the better response of African Americans for health education over motivational interviewing really could be accounted for by this preference. And if you therefore, you could argue now, match preference to style of communication, you should get better outcomes. So what we see here, just to summarize what I just said, these are the unadjusted effects. So in this case, you see that motivational interviewing outperformed health education for white people. That's what the squares are for all of these outcomes. But once we adjusted for your preference for communication style, the effects were essential, and that basically helps us conclude that the differential treatment response was due to this one baseline variable. Now you may ask, what does this have to do with complexity? Hold on, I hope it will become clear in a few minutes. One of the things this type of finding tells us is we have to start to think about using matching and mismatching designs. So we currently have a grant that was going to be reviewed shortly, where we're going to take motivational interviewing and this more directive health education and proactively match it by race, but even further by your autonomy preference, so that people who say, I want a directive approach, they'll be in the match condition, they would get health education, and the mismatch condition, they'll get health motivational interviewing. So this is one of the ways to handle complexity. Now I'm going to give you much more sophisticated ones in the next few minutes that I hope you'll find interesting. I just mentioned 3 of our studies where there was an unexpected but significant moderator effect, that is, the treatment worked differently for subgroups. I just went through 2 of the most widely impactful behavioral studies in the US. I don't know if you've heard of them. I'm guessing you've all heard of DPP. You may not have heard of Look Ahead, but they're both behavioral treatments with either people with prediabetes or people with frank diabetes. And what they found is, not surprising, moderated effects. So Look Ahead worked better for those with a baseline history of CVD. The DPP was more effective for women, those who had higher baseline glucose and A1C levels, and women with a history of gestational diabetes. Again, if you peel the skin off of our intervention effects, I think what you find now I'm not going to say always, but there's very often interaction effects, moderator effects. And what does that mean for us? What do we do with that? So I want to make a few observations about interaction effects. So first of all, most of these are not a priori, and that's a problem. It means that you are doing a lot of unplanned analyses that make you more subject to spurious findings or type 1 error. Therefore, we really need replication. Now, tying the two last topics together, we know replication is difficult because if you change any of the initial conditions, you may not be able to replicate. So we have to really think about replication with high fidelity if we want to reproduce people's interaction effects. I think if you change little pieces of that study, you may not be able to replicate the interaction effect. And if so, what do we do with that information? Is it, again, true but useless information? So I want to argue that over the next few minutes that there are some designs that might better be able to capture some of these complex patterns. So before we do the presentation of novel designs, I want to introduce 2 more concepts: optimal variability and therapeutic inertia. I hope you find them as fascinating as I do. Here are 2 heart rate patterns, okay? Take a look. Now, one of these heart rate patterns is a very healthy individual, and one is someone who's quite ill. Which one do you think is the healthy person? The very predictable, very monotonic, or the more chaotic pattern? Well, this is actually the healthy individual. This heart rate pattern is actually what you want to see for maximal health. This person actually has sleep apnea. And you would find a similar pattern, although it's slightly variant, if someone had congestive heart failure. So what this means is that, at least in heart rate variability, the ideal state has a little bit of chaos to it. Now, how does that influence perhaps behavioral interventions? Hold on for a minute. It turns out that if you have too little variability, you might have a congestive heart failure. If too much variability, you have VFAB. There's a sweet spot. There's this perfect happy medium where there's this thing called optimal randomness, okay? It's true for sleep quality. So if you look at people's brain waves while they sleep, if they're completely predictable, they usually have a sleep disorder. If there's a little bit of optimal variability, this middle sweet spot, people have high sleep quality. It's true when you look at how people walk. If people's steps are completely predictable, that's actually a sign of being unhealthy. A little bit of wobble, a little bit of variability is a good sign. And it's true for many other conditions or phenomena. The question is it true for behavior change interventions? Should we start to think about optimal variability in behavior change interventions? Now, it may sound like an obvious thing to say yes to, but it's not how we approach our interventions. We approach interventions with fidelity. Keep doing the same thing. Do your motivational interviewing the same time, the same way, the same therapist. That may be the wrong approach. The second concept we need, though, to close the loop is this idea of therapeutic inertia. This is something that has been written about over the last 30 years, and it occurs when healthcare providers stop trying to change therapy. So for example, when you get diagnosed with hypertension, the physician may, for the first year, try 4 medications until they get the optimal blood pressure control. But over time, even though the blood pressure values may be out of control or could be diabetes, the provider stops trying to make changes. They habituate, they exhaust. Now, it happens not just in medicine, it happens in psychotherapy. Initially, when people go into psychotherapy, they're talking a lot about change, and over time, what happens, they go to psychotherapy just to complain, to talk, to vent, and they stop sort of working on change as much as just having a positive discussion. So that's when the practitioner exhibits therapeutic inertia. Patients also can exhibit therapeutic inertia. They learn to defend themselves. They learn to say things to the therapist that makes the therapist nod their head and say, you're doing it right. There's a very famous study that when patients start to use the words of the therapist starts to see their patient as succeeding, even if there's no change. So how do we combine all of these observations? So first of all, I think we should start to think about more complex analytic tools. There's a new one called PITE. Some colleagues of mine have produced that, and I'll show it in a second. And then an older one that is still very powerful, signal detection. Yes, there are some problems because it does multiple comparisons, but it can detect 2, 3, 4-way interactions for you, and there's software available on the market for that. I do encourage you, if you have an analytic quantitative approach, to look at the PITE, because it allows, by a form of meta-analysis, it starts to look at what interventions work for whom, and it can identify multiple moderators so that you can start to match interventions to user characteristics. So if you haven't seen this, take a look. Now I'd like to get into 3 intervention designs that I think better handle complexity. And I'm guessing most of you have heard some of these. The one that I want to spend the most time, though, is RL, because I think for some of you that will be the most novel. So first of all, there's most designs, okay? And there's 2 features of a most design that I think are critical. One is that there's multiple phases. That is, first you try to detect what components of an intervention look promising. You screen out the less active ingredients, and then you replicate in a larger study whether or not the initial promising intervention elements seem to work. But the other aspect that I think that may be even more important is the idea of a fractional factorial design. What do we mean? So let's take 6 different intervention elements we could vary, okay? And I've written this grant, so I'm going to use smoking cessation as the example. I have 6 theoretical things I want to change in intervention. I want to change the mood state the patient is in, so I'll show you. I want to intervene on high energy days and low energy days, depressed days and happy days. I want to test whether or not changing the counselor is better than keeping the same counselor. I want to test whether changing the day of therapy is better than a fixed day of therapy. I want to test whether or not it's good to change the time of therapy. I want to test different medications, different types of nicotine replacement or Zyban or Chantix. Then I want to test whether or not we should vary the times per week that we meet. And finally, should we vary the intervention, for example, motivational intervening versus health education? So these are 6 intervention elements that I think are promising. If we use a traditional factorial design, we would need 36 cells and over 1,000 individuals in order to conduct this study. Now, it would be very useful if we had enough people. It would be great to look at all of the 5-way interactions and to see whether or not any of these combinations are more effective. But that type of study would be very expensive and very difficult. So instead, we use a fractional factorial design in a MOST study. And what it basically says is there are certain interactions. So maybe the combination of this varying and this varying and this varying, I just don't care about. It's not that interesting. I can't do a lot with it. So we basically have a construction of our study cells called aliasing that basically says we're not going to bother to test that combination. And this is actually what the fractional design would look like. We're going to vary the 6 intervention elements, but we're not going to test every single interaction. We're just going to test 2-way interactions, whether or not this interacts with this or this interacts with this, but not whether this and this and this interact with this and this. But by doing so, we cut our sample size by 50, 60, in some cases 70%, and we can still detect main effects of these 6 treatment elements and at least 2-way interactions. So that's the beauty of a MOST design, the fractional component. There's the screening component, which is interesting, but here I'm focusing on the fractional component, allows us to test multiple intervention compositions with a very efficient sampling structure. Now I'd like to talk about smart designs. Smart designs have been around for a while, and I think most people think of them as re-randomization designs. It's not the only way to define a smart design, but most commonly, people use it to take people who get an intervention, and there may be a control group here as well, and we take the responders, we take the non-responders, and we re-randomize them differently. So the responders, that is people did well, they may get a maintenance intervention. So they may get 2 different relapse prevention interventions, whereas the non-responders, we may step up the intensity. So here maybe we did an app, they didn't respond to the app, and now let's add motivational intervening, which is more expensive, but maybe more efficacious. And so we intensify treatment. And we could further randomize them to either get moderate levels of motivational interviewing or high levels of motivational interviewing. And we could continue randomizing them depending on their outcome. Now I'd like to introduce reinforcement learning, which you could say is an extension of smart designs. Now, reinforcement learning in very simple terms is simply a machine learning approach that allows each individual in our study to get a different sequence or combination of intervention elements. Typically, there's 2 things that the reinforcement learning is trying to maximize. Either it's trying to maximize your behavioral outcome, that is, let's use smoking cessation, that it's trying to make you have a quit attempt. And it will keep testing which intervention elements. It could be like I showed you before, motivational intervening versus health education. It could be intervening on different days. It could be intensity of the messaging. Maybe we can test fear messaging versus hope messaging. It will keep testing what you need to respond towards the right direction, in this case, a quit attempt. We also use RL designs to minimize cost efficiency, so that if you're doing well on treatment A and there's a cheaper treatment, we will try and move you to the cheaper treatment unless your outcome starts to deteriorate. Now, what this means is we basically have adaptive individual interventions. I hope how you can see implicitly this embraces complexity. This basically says, just like chaos theory, that people have similar patterns of response, but they're all slightly different. And it's hard to replicate them because every pathway is just a little different. Well, I think that's what RL really celebrates. RL really embraces the fact that everyone's pathway to success can be a little different. So what the RL algorithm does is it says, let me see how you're doing right now. Are you moving towards quitting? For example, what's your intention to quitting on a 0 to 10 scale? Are you an 8? Okay, well, if you're an 8, let's keep going. Let's keep trying this because you're moving in the right direction. But if your intention is dropping, let's switch it. Let's try something else, a different message frequency, a time of day, or a different message type, okay? I want to talk about 3 RL functions that you could use, but in particular, it's the third one that I'm most excited to share with you. But this is the 3, I think the top 2 of these 3 are very common. I've already mentioned them: increasing efficacy amongst people who initially fail and decreasing costs. And then we'll get to the novel one here, which is how we incorporate therapeutic inertia into an RL function. So here's a traditional RL to increase efficacy. So there's 2 treatments, A and B, and let's just use the continued example of health education versus motivational interviewing, or fear messages versus autonomy supportive messages, okay? Health belief model, self-determination theory. A traditional RL algorithm would say, let's look at people who are unsuccessful. Either they haven't quit, or their motivation to quit or intention to quit are low. In one arm, what you would do is, if you received intervention A, could be the health ed or could be fear messages, we will take you and in one arm, you will continue to get A. In the experimental arm, we'll switch you to B. So we're going to see whether or not we can move you towards quitting by going from A to B. Or if you had B, in the control arm, in effect, you maintain B, and in the intervention arm, you would switch to A. And it can do this many times. It can do this every day, every week, every month, until it finds the best combination for you that predicts success. Now, for those of you who actually do RL research, you're aware of that when the system starts and it doesn't have a lot of data from an individual yet, it'll have to use data from a previous population to make its best prediction. So here's the economic version of RL. We're trying to save costs. So in this model, we have 3 interventions. A, which is less expensive than B, and B is less expensive than C, and C is a control condition. A is a control condition, so it costs the least. So in this model, if we wanted to, we can look at people who are succeeding, whereas in the previous example, we were re-randomizing the RL based upon failure. Here we have people who are doing well. I have to try and move this thing here. Thank you. Okay. So in this case, what we would do is take people who are doing well in their behavior, either they're moving towards quitting or they're losing weight, whatever it is. And remember, B costs less than C. So what we can do is that we can have one arm continue with B and the other arm gets stepped down to the less expensive intervention. Now, as long as their outcome doesn't get worse, they continue to either quit smoking, lose weight, or at least their intention to quit smoking is moving in the right direction, we will continue with the least expensive intervention. Now, if they were originally was C, we might move them one step down to B rather than jumping to A. So basically, we can test moving everyone who is successful down one step to the less expensive arm, and then we continue to monitor their success. And unless things go badly, we would continue them in the least expensive condition. So this is really about saving society costs. So as I promised, I would like to give you what I think is the more novel way to use RL to account for therapeutic inertia and to account for complexity. So here's a design. I have not done this study yet. We've tested it in a simulation. We're about to launch a study. So I don't know if it works, but here's what we've come up with. So let's take successful people. Now, the actual study we're doing is with gun violence. We're taking youth who have been injured with a violent incident, a knife, a fight, or a gun, and we're trying over time, we have an app to try and get them not to carry their guns. But it could be any behavior. It could be, again, smoking cessation, diabetes. As long as we can measure their intermediate progress, we can do this. So here's the interesting twist to this study design. So we take successful people. So in the case of the gun study, it's people who are not carrying their gun or people who have very low intentions to carry their gun. Again, for smoking cessation, it could be people who have quit or people who have an intention to quit. In the control version, the RL will let people continue with whatever intervention element was successful, which is how we normally would do things, okay? But here, what is novel, we are violating sort of the rules of the first RL I mentioned, and even though they're successful, we're still going to proactively switch them. So let's see if I can make this perfectly clear. So to anticipate therapeutic inertia, we are proactively taking people who are doing fine with A, but we're worried they're going to hit habituation and therapeutic inertia, so we're going to proactively switch them to B. And then we believe that if we're right, this group will actually do better than this group, which is counter how we normally do things. In a linear world, we would say, oh, if they're doing well with A, stay with A. What this design is able to test is, well, maybe this is going to get you into that therapeutic inertia problem. Now, another variation of that is simply if someone was doing well with B, in the traditional control arm, they would continue with B. And in the RL condition with the planned variability, we would proactively switch them to A. Okay, so this is a variation on RL. It's a little bit strange in an RL to talk about a control condition, but I think you certainly can combine the RL technology with a group that is specifically not getting any variability. So let me summarize what I hope we've done, and then I would very much like to have a few questions. We've tried to show you that sudden nonlinear change occurs, it's common, and it's also more enduring. It's sort of a better pathway to change. The big question I hope you're all asking is, how do we induce it? Can we create interventions that instill or inspire sudden change? That complexity science, and particularly sensitivity to initial conditions, may help explain low research replicability, particularly for behavioral research. Complexity and sensitivity to initial conditions might explain treatment moderation. It leads us to considering matching and mismatching designs that can verify whether or not these non-a priori moderator effects were real. One thing I didn't talk about, but I think we should address, is so far I've sort of been thinking about two-way interactions, like we said, race. But in fact, there may be multiple levels of interaction. Maybe motivational interviewing interacts by race, preference for communication style, age, religion, income. How do we handle that? So when we start to talk about greater than two-way interactions, we need massive data sets. And finally, I hope I was able to show that there are novel designs, SMART, MOST, and RL, that can help embrace complexity and start to test these complex pathways of success that individuals can have. Thank you very much, and I hope we can get a few questions.
Amazing, fantastic talk, thank you. I think we do have questions. Matti, have you spotted?
Yeah, could someone unmute Kjell Peters, and he can ask some question he might still have?
And perhaps Keegan also, because Keegan Nittle's question is also about sample size determination in the designs that you presented.
Yes, there's software for these now. It used to be we had to do them manually. I can maybe send you some links, Keegan. There are still some parts of it, though, that you have to do manually. So, for example, in the RL studies, they're complicated designs. It also depends whether or not you're having this condition, this fixed condition that doesn't get the RL. That adds another level of complexity. But Susan Murphy and Linda Collins are the two gurus. Susan Murphy is at Harvard. Linda Collins is at Penn State. I think she might be retiring. They have published software on their websites, I believe, to do these power calculations. But if you contact me, I can try and get you links.
Is GJ now unmuted?
Yes, I'm muted. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. You never know what you're doing. That was really cool, first, before I begin. So thank you very much for this awesome uncanned presentation. I had like 2 questions that you answered in the same presentation a bit later, so that was really cool. I have a question related to Keegan's question. Is there like open source software for doing these RL interventions / studies?
That I have not seen any open source RL. We have our own programmer who's doing it. I will ask him, and then what I can do is if I find something, I can send it to maybe Nelly or Maddie, and hopefully they could send it around. I have not seen any yet. It is, I think, a little early perhaps for that to exist, but I'm sure it will be available in the next year or so. Someone will put something out there.
Cool, thanks.
So I see the question about, yes, our interaction effects. One of them was a priori. We a priori did feel that high autonomy needs would respond better to tailoring, but the racial interaction with MI was not expected. So I agree, we shouldn't overinterpret them. I think the question is, are they interesting and potentially valid enough that we want to use resources to replicate them? That's really, I think, the challenge. Do we sort of just write them off as spurious and type 1 error, or is there enough here that we want to try and replicate it? So I think it in part depends on whether or not it's consistent or inconsistent with prior theory, or if you have any explanatory variables. In the case of our race interaction with motivational interviewing, we found this explanatory variable. And because of that, although it was not a priori, and because that we could dismiss it as a spurious type 1 error, but we found that had a story that made sense, that the preference for autonomy support explained this, and I'm putting my fingers up in quotes, spurious effect. I start to have more faith in it. And because of that, we are going to try and replicate it, because I think there may be a theory consistent story there. But you're right, these non-a priori post hoc interaction effects maybe could be dismissed simply because they're type 1 error.
Yeah, there was an interesting study in medicine that came out a couple of years ago where they studied something like 180 interaction effects, and only something like 5 of those were ever tried to replicate.
Yeah. And so it really, should we be publishing them? Helen Kramer at Stanford has written a lot about this. But I think as a profession, we should, in our clinical trials registry, I know there's a US one called clinicaltrials.gov, and I know there's a European one, or at least a Dutch one, but I believe a European one, that it would be nice if we had to list before we did our analyses, our moderator effects and why. That might help a little bit.
There's a question in the example of unplanned quitting of smoking, did they collect a variable capturing the number of previous attempts to quit smoking?
I believe in the Ferguson study they did, and in our study we did, and I don't recall those having a huge influence, but that's a very good question. I'm curious, whoever asked it, do you feel, and maybe you could type it in the chat if you don't want to speak up, but do you feel more prior quit attempts? Do you think that would make you more or less likely to have a sudden gain or an unplanned quit attempt? Which direction do you think having more prior quit attempts would push you? More towards planned change or unplanned? I don't know if he or she wants to speak.
I think she might have dropped out. I can't see her on the attendee list. And there's a question by Julian. What influence does the researcher have on the data when trying to reapply or repeat the study? So replicates. How is the bias taken into, the potential bias taken into consideration?
I think, Julian, the highest level of replication is when someone completely neutral, unrelated to the prior research group replicates it. Now, it's very rare, but that helps to control for the fact that the developer has a particular bias to want their interventions to succeed. You're more likely to get funded, you're more likely to be able to bring it into the market. So it is very powerful if the replication group has no vested interest, has no horse in the race, but that's very rare. And it would be nice if we had more neutral third-party replication. I would like to address, because we only have 1 minute, Natasha asked, what is sort of the practical intervention implication? I want to address that because this is something that I think about a lot. Natasha, what I think this tells me is we should not get locked into one behavioral approach. I love motivational interviewing, and I'm also a religiously observant self-determination theory person. So I am very much, I've drank the Kool-Aid of those two. But what this data forces me to think that, well, maybe you have to think outside your comfort zone. Maybe try sometimes to mix up your approach with people. If you have done motivational interviewing and it doesn't work, try something more directive. If you've tried self-determination theory, try to be more directive with them and not let theory be shackles. Don't let it constrain you. So I think the idea that we should introduce planned variability goes against how we were trained. But I think if we can understand it may be beneficial to change things up, we might get that critical transition and avoid that therapeutic inertia.
Can I just ask one question? How did you originally get interested in complex dynamical systems and chaos theory, and kind of, because you have written about its relations to behavior change and motivation already years ago. So how did you first come about these topics and start thinking?
Thank you. I think it started with failure, trying to explain in our papers who changed and why. We're getting very little R squared. We really are having a hard time predicting who is changing and why. And we also had interventions that we thought were perfect theoretically, but in practice didn't work. So I think in this case, our inability to change behavior and our inability to predict it led me on a search for maybe it's because we're locked into this linear, consistent framework. And if we can get outside of it, maybe we'll be able to have better interventions and better explanations for why they work.
Thank you so much. I think we're soon running out, or actually we ran out of time already, even though probably many people are still here and would probably love to go on chatting. There is one raised hand. Do we have time to take one more question, or should we? Is it okay, Ken?
Oh, I'm happy to. I have till 9:30.
Yes. So can Sarmita unmute Esa-Pekka Takala? And while you're unmuting, GJ is asking, are these chats saved, and somehow maybe we can figure a way how to save them. But Esa-Pekka, go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you for your nice presentation. With behavioral changes as well, with other treatments as well, there is usually so that we have the intervention and then we have to have defined the final outcomes. But usually the cause of the intervention is that there are necessary events that have to happen before the final outcome will appear. And my question is about the monitoring of the intermediate outcomes.
Yes. So let's call them mediators, if that's okay. That what I like about RL is I think has a finger on the pulse of the mediator. It's checking the intermediate outcome and letting that drive what is your next intervention step. But even in a straight 2-group randomized trial, it's so important to measure mediators ideally before the behavior changes occurred so we don't confound effect and cause. So it is very powerful when you see studies that measure the mediator 2 times, baseline and sometime in the middle of the study, but before people made their final behavior change. Mediation analyses, I believe, are one of the most powerful ways to test our theories. And then there's something called moderated mediation, so that we can show, this is perfect complexity, this intermediate variable like change in attitude or change in self-efficacy only mediated it for X group, for men or women or Finns but not Swedes. So moderated mediation, again, you need a pretty large sample, but that's a way to again appreciate complexity in causal analyses.
Thank you.